So Trump has been highly critical of Boeing's plane in the past. Remember, he really criticized the price. How do you expect the visit to go? And keeping in mind just a couple of days after the unions voted no to unionize.
Well, I expect it to go very well because Trump has used the bully pulpit so effectively to persuade business leaders to make more products in the United States. If you're going to sell it here, make it here. And he's reiterated many of those successes from the podium on that visit, on that press conference yesterday. But now the real change occurs. The tax cuts and the repeal of Obamacare. And let me underscore that repealing Obamacare is a jobs program because 156 million people, half the nation, get their coverage through their employer. And that law forced employers to offer a benefit package that was far more expensive than what they had offered previously.
Right.
So employers, to make up the cost of that, not only raised deductibles and out-of-pocket costs, they also reduced wages.
Yeah, and
they
also
held back on wage increases. And employees really felt that.
Yeah, and they turned, right, they turned full-time into part-time jobs.
Right, that was one of the most perplexing things about the Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, is that you had these companies called 49ers that would have more than 49 employees. And the fact that these Democrats have argued that this has not been a drag on the economy, it hasn't been a drag on job creation, is kind of laughable. But how long do we have to wait, Betsy, for this to really be implemented in terms of the replacement plan? How long is it going to take? Because, again, the uncertainty of that is also a drag on business. As they stand around and wait with their hands up going, what are we going to be coping with 2 years from now?
Well, based on the promises that were made by Paul Ryan this week, and you heard the president himself say they're going to be rolling out legislation, they claim, by the end of March. Now, when it will be effective is another story, but I expect that the employer mandate and the individual mandate forcing people to buy these Obamacare plans, both of those mandates will no longer be effective because the president and his Health and Human Services Secretary also have the discretion not to enforce those mandates, and they're the real drag.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because the IRS is, if you leave it blank on your taxes, they're just going to skip over it. They're actually not going to come after you and have you refile your taxes. But I'm glad you brought up...
That was like his first executive order.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
He's just like, this is nonsense. But I'm glad you brought up the jobs creation part because when we look at the jobs numbers that come out every month, you can see that companies that are 49 people or less have only contributed about 10% every time, 12% added new jobs. So it's not trickling through. And we saw actually the first, after Donald Trump was elected, the first jobs numbers we got, it was 12% small businesses added to that number. That's a super small number. And that's still showing that small businesses are tepid and worried. They're actually not hiring yet.
Great point. And also, we saw the shortest work week in history as more and more full-timers were pushed down below 30 hours so that their employers were not affected by the employer mandate.
That's a good point. The president tweeted this earlier today. He said, despite the long delays by the Democrats in finally approving Dr. Tom Price, the repeal and replacement of Obamacare is moving fast. The president also held his first solo press conference since taking office yesterday. He addressed the timeline for changing the Health Care Act and tackling tax reform as well. We're all waiting for that. Listen.
Tax reform is going to happen fairly quickly. We're doing Obamacare. We're in final stages. We should be submitting the initial plan in March, early March, I would say. And we have to, as you know, statutorily and for reasons of budget, we have to go first. It's not like, frankly, the tax would be easier, in my opinion, but for statutory reasons and for budgetary reasons, we have to submit the health care sooner. So we'll be submitting health care sometime in early March, mid-March, and after that, we're going to come up, and we're doing very well on tax reform.
So he keeps answering this question that I guess market participants have been worried about. But now Fox News polls out this week show that cutting taxes is more important to voters than replacing Obamacare, Betsy. How do you think Americans will react to this news? Look, we know that he's trying to do both, right, but will we actually see tax reform in the time frame that we expected, which is before, obviously, around the summertime now, as our expectations have been pushed
That's right.
up?
Well, it appears the answer is yes, and that is really good news because everything hinges on cutting taxes. And frankly, I'm worried about this border tax proposal that Speaker Paul Ryan has his heart set on, because it doesn't have broad support in Congress or in the White House, and it's frankly a tax hit.
Yeah, Lee
on
Carter,
so
I want to
many
get your take on
consumers.
this, because
Yeah, right.
the battle on this border adjustment tax is obviously raging. The Speaker of the House, Paul Ryan, defended the plan yesterday during his own news conference. He used props to make his case. Listen to this.
Here's what Japan does when they make this tape recorder. When they send it for export, they take the tax off of it. And then it comes to America, and it's not taxed. And it comes here to compete against our good, which is taxed. Theirs was untaxed twice. When America makes something, like a tape recorder, we tax it. And then we send it to Japan. As it enters Japan, it's taxed again to compete against their tape recorder. So we are doing it to ourselves. We are hurting American manufacturing and jobs. We are putting a bias against making things in America in the tax code.
Look, I get all this. I get the negatives around the border adjustment tax. But what about the argument that this is also catch-up? Most countries, 100 countries actually, have some kind of a border adjustment tax or a VAT tax.
Look, I think the bottom line is this is unpopular. People can't agree on it. They need to get the corporate taxes through. They need to get the other tax cuts through. They should separate it out and make it a separate issue so that if this is something they want to make the case for, they can make the case for. But I think all people agree taxes need to come down, and that's going to be a boon to the continue to be a boon to the market. And I think the bottom line is separate it.
You
It's a
are
trade
so
issue.
right. It has to be the president's tax agenda, not Paul Ryan's tax agenda. And there's another glitch like this. Ryan is also trying to put a cap on the tax-exempt nature of employer-provided health plans, so that all these big union workers in the Rust Belt states who gave Trump his victory are suddenly going to get hit with a tax on their very generous health plans.
Not good.
That is a non-starter
Well,
that
but
has
that was
to come
in the
out.
Affordable Care Act, actually. It was the Cadillac health care
That's right,
tax.
and
It
it's
was a
got to be
40%
repealed and
it was
not duplicated.
It was a 40%.
Two things,
Wait,
though.
let me finish.
Yeah.
It was a 40% excise tax, and it was supposed to be enacted in 2018, and they had to kick it down the road because it was so unpopular. But again, you have to admit that you got to get costs down on those employer plans. You have to admit.
I do not believe that it's the business of the federal government to tell anybody how much they should spend for their health care.
Yeah,
But they do through Medicare, though, Betsy. That's the problem.
Well, that's the point.
I mean, Medicare is a giant.
But
it's a
Uncle
giant
Sam doesn't know
government
what
insurance
kind of
program.
generous health plan your family needs, and the government shouldn't be taxing you for having generous health plans.
Ryan's trying to do the border adjustment tax just so to generate revenue, because he's worried about the budget, and also it goes back to it could be a source for paying for the wall, because we actually do import a lot of goods from Mexico. So they were talking about $500 billion that they could generate from this border tax adjustment alone. So that was one of his arguments that he was contesting against it. But it is
Well, they're talking about $1 trillion actually to raise with this border tax.
yeah. So they were so it's a
Over 10 years.
It's a trade issue, not necessarily a tax issue. So they should address it on its own and separate it.
Good point.